The Executive and the Mystic podcast, co-hosted by Fred LeFranc and Kristina Wiltsee, where wisdom meets business.
Good day. Hi, I'm Fred, and I'm the executive.
And I am Kristina, and I am the Mystic. Welcome to the Executive and the Mystic podcast, where wisdom meets business. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Fred LeFranc, who is joining us from a beautiful locale and something that is much deserved rest. Of course, I'm making him work in this time. So welcome, Fred.
You're a taskmaster. You're a taskmaster.
Indeed.
Okay, and let me introduce Kristina. I am in Antigua on a beautiful island. I wish I could share the view, but it would just irritate you. But Kristina is a perspective alchemist, and I think today's topic, which you're going to bring up, is going to give us an opportunity to really sort of see different perspectives, because the big question today is what, Kristina?
Is introspection the enemy? That's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we do that, please like and subscribe wherever you are listening. If this interests you, it helps people find us and it helps us grow just a little bit. So yes, we're talking about is introspection the enemy? And this came up because David Senra had a podcast, and he had Marc Andreessen, excuse me, who is the original creator of Netscape. Creator meaning like he programmed it as a child, right? Of Netscape, which for those who are younger may not know that Netscape was one of the original internet browsers.
The original internet browser.
The original internet browser. It predated Internet Explorer, which people may not even know about. It was everything back in the day. And it was fascinating. It was a fascinating interview, and it really caught my attention. And I've had a lot of discussions with a lot of the executives that I work with about it. And I wanted to talk to Fred about it today, because we have a very different kind of view of this, and Fred does in particular. But the scope of the conversation was that Marc Andreessen, who now is actually an investment, he has an investment firm, is that he says that introspection is something that he tries to do as little as possible. His definition of introspection from this clip that we're kind of taking out of the context of the entire video, and you can see this in the show notes, is that when you are thinking about the past, you have a tendency to get stuck in the past, right? And he said, this is a problem in my company. This is a problem at home, is that people who think about the past get stuck in that past, and that introspection and the version of the self and wanting to look at the self and look at the contents of the self is a relatively new experience, that the individual didn't even exist as a concept. And that people like Sam Walton, for instance, just loved creating Walmart and didn't have to introspect about creating Walmart. He just woke up every day and did it, right? And so he gives a number of different examples throughout the interview, as well as in this particular clip, to say why how in human history, there was no benefit to introspection, which he thinks of as therapy, I think, a lot. You can kind of tell.
And it came recently. He refers to J.P. Morgan as one of his heroes and idols. And that is more of a modern affliction in a way that did not exist in the past.
Right. And that the individual came about in the 1910s and 20s. And so we're going to talk about that today. Fred, why don't you start us out? What do you think? Is introspection the enemy?
Well, the first thing I thought about was Marcus Aurelius, who wrote this book, I think a couple thousand years ago, or it was his diary, The Reflections. He was a Roman emperor. And if you ever saw The Gladiator, that gives you a clue of who Marcus Aurelius was. Mm-hmm. And this was a warrior king who wrote some of the most beautiful and profound thoughts about leadership and humanity and the role that an individual plays in society. And he was the ruler of an empire. And he wrestled with all these different issues. And I think is probably one of the earliest great treatises on human reflection and ideas and the significance of a leader within society and organization. So when Mark says this is sort of a relatively new thing, I go, well, I don't know how new it is. Now, things may come and go in waves. I get that. So the answer to your question, is introspection the enemy? I can't see how it can be. I respect his point of view. I'm not going to judge him for that. That's his point of view. And I guess the befuddlement and puzzlement that I have is a person who obviously had a big impact on society, because he created the first Netscape, the first internet browser. when the internet was very, very young and nascent and had such an impact, how could one not reflect on the impact of that alone? Much less the fact that now as the head of an investment firm, Andreessen Horowitz, with his partner Ben Horowitz, who are investing in companies that continue to innovate and change the future. At some point, I would think one would look at the entire enormity of what he has done from the very beginning as a young man, as I think a college student till now, and not say, wow, this has changed the world in some way, shape, or form. Not from a standpoint of look at me, I'm important, but more of, okay, this is this continuum. It's a continuum of evolution and thought leadership. That's what I'm sort of struck with as a question, more a curiosity. I don't have a judgment, it's a curiosity.
Well, it's an interesting thing, and I would agree. It feels like, I can see from one perspective where he would be like, oh, but I'm just in the middle of creating. Why would I ever think about what I've done before when, I'm so concerned with creating something new? I sometimes feel that way with content, right? And that I used to post something and worry about how it was doing. The only thing I do now is I look and see, did it do well or did it not? If it does well, let me see if I can repeat that, right? And it just becomes this kind of movement forward. But I do feel that, to your point, there's a couple of different ways that we can approach what it looks like to mean to have introspection or not, right?
Right. That's the question I was going to ask you, because really,
yeah.
Can you define introspection so we get on the same place? Because I'm a busy person as well. I get up every morning and I'm doing stuff, and I get up early and I work long and hard. But let's talk about what is introspection to begin with, so we start to have an understanding of that.
Absolutely. So I mentioned that his definition of introspection is looking into the past, right? And I think that is an incredibly limited view of introspection. I think that self-reflection, which is self-reflection that can happen in a moment to stop an emotional reaction that's happening at this point, or self-reflection to recognize that maybe your motives for moving forward in the action that you're enacting is actually coming from a place that, is not the most holistic part of yourself. It may involve looking at the past. That may be a therapy that you do to recognize that all of us are an accumulation of strategies that we've taken on throughout our lives. And the more that we can recognize those strategies and fine tune them, very similar to what we talk about in the ABCs, the better. And so when I describe introspection, it's simply the act of, instead of looking forward and acting all the time, you're actually looking at all of the filters that your action has to pass through in order to come into the world.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess self-reflection does not mean that one is evaluating whether they're having a good impact on the world or people around them. It's merely just an understanding of one's personal growth. And so I know entrepreneurs who are very, very successful and have very little consideration for others around them other than themselves and their own success. And I'm not saying this critically. That's just how they are. There's not even a nanosecond of thought around that. And we're not judging that. We're not going there. We're really just talking about, does one look at one's life, and in the context that it's been a while, things happen as children, as young adults, as we matured, if you had the blessings to get married and have children. All those things are opportunities to create an opportunity to say, who am I? What have I accomplished? What's this about? Am I becoming the best part of myself or not? Those are the kind of questions that come up in self-reflection. I'm sure, Kristina, you work with so many people. What other questions would an individual use as part of the process of self-reflection and introspection?
Self-reflection has a lot to do with, people looking at it, very similar to what companies do at the company level, right? Which is that they're going to look at what's their purpose, what's their drive, what's holding them back, what are the blocks that they keep looking at, that they keep finding over and over and over again. That's a lot of the work I do is like trying to find the pattern within your life to be able to find a more effortless way of being in the world and getting things done, but getting things done not from a place of a void, of like, I don't have this, so therefore I have to fill this endless void because nobody loved me, so now I have to be famous for the rest of my life so that everybody can love me. But saying, actually, I want to come into the world and I want to create from this void, but I don't need to look to external validation or external filling of the holes that exist within me, right? And so that's one of the things I would say about this. I think in some ways, we're talking about two very clear things here, which is that introspection is the internal look at what is the mechanism and the filters and all of the things that are coming in that motivate you towards a certain action, recognizing that you cannot separate your past from your future. You are the connecting point between your past and your future. Everything that you enact in the world is a reflection of that past state. No matter how much you try and act without it, you would not be where you are without all of the actions that brought you to this place. And therefore, any action that you take moving forward is absolutely a result of that past state. So that's one part of it. So that's the introspection, is recognizing that you got here because of what's happened. And every move that you make in the future is because of what has happened. And there's a benefit to being able to see that sometimes, even if it's 10 minutes a day in meditation or something like that, right? But also, introspection, we've talked about this in the law of correspondence, this idea that like what you do here is going to reflect at the company level, and if you have a global impact, is going to reflect at the global level. And when you look interior, you also are going to look at the interior of your company, and you're also going to look at the interior of that global level. And it's important to recognize that wherever you're leading from, if you're leading from a place of void within yourself, you're going to be leading your company very likely from that same place of void. And if you do have a global impact, you're going to be like leading the world from a place of a void, and being able to see the impact that you have on everything around you with your decisions that you make, especially if you're particularly powerful, rich, or you've done something groundbreaking like this. It's important to look at that and to recognize the consequences of that.
So let's talk a little bit about duration, right? Because we don't want to get caught up in the fact that one must sit there for hours and hours and sort of reflect.
Yep.
Realistically, self-reflection takes how long? You mentioned possibly during meditation or just a quiet moment to sort of review events around you, things that have come, things that are present, things that you want in the future. Let's talk about a practical method for how one would apply introspection.
Absolutely. So I think that introspection is very much so like acquiring a new skill, like surfing, right? So you may go to a surfing how-to, right? Or you may spend, surfing is one of those harder things. So you can use it, fill in the blank for anything, skiing, and you're like, I'm going to go and I'm going to do in-depth work to understand how to ski. And so now every single time that I go ski, I'm going to be able to just ski down the hill. Like I remember how to do it, right? Right. Introspection is very much the same thing. When you start off with introspection, it can be like wading in a sea of not knowing what you're supposed to pay attention to, not knowing what's relevant, getting caught. Like, again, he's right. I really think in like this idea that you can get caught in the past, trying to find patterns, trying to find what's going on. But once you understand how to navigate that space, which is very different for almost everybody I talk to, right? It looks very, very different for a lot of different people, depending on what it is that they're addressing at the moment. But then it can be 5 or 10 minutes a day. Then it can be, oh wait, I'm bent out of shape. It's time for a little bit of introspection. Like it's not, I don't want to be bent out of shape, or I'm actually not in the best place when I'm bent out of shape. And so, there's maintenance every day, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. I usually say 30 minutes. If you can sit down for 30 minutes, that's a wonderful thing once you've developed the skill. And again, introspection can look like watching your thoughts, watching your feelings, watching like literal sensations on your body. It can look like a lot of different things as a maintenance procedure. Okay, so what I'm hearing you say, and that's good, is that introspection is not just reflecting on the past, it's also being aware of where you are now. Yes. Okay, so it's actually sounds a little bit like the beginnings of self-awareness, just kind of where am I now? And if I'm in a state of, being out of shape, what caused that? That's introspection, right? Yes. Or other things that may go further back. It's not all about going back to your childhood of, why were you abused or what horrible things happened to. It's just that things that happened in the past create who we are at the current present time, and then will lead into some future. So introspection has a much broader definition of what time frame we're looking at,
but also a much simpler application of what needs to do. It's not some deep, sit on the rock and meditate with a monk and all that stuff. It could be just a very simple observation of what's happening to oneself right now. Is that what I'm hearing correctly?
That's exactly it. Because I think once you do some introspection, you recognize that what's happening right now, you can follow all of those breadcrumbs of what's happening right now to the past. When you get really good at it, you can even sometimes lead it to the future. We won't get into that today, but the vast majority of everything that's happening now can be attributed to something that happened in the past. And the way that I view things is not that it's just a collection of memory and look, I'm gonna follow this breadcrumb or pull this string as a kind of an easier way of visualizing it in your mind. So I'm going to pull the string, and I wasn't given a teddy bear when my sibling was, and therefore I created a teddy bear company so everybody could have teddy bears all the time, right? It's usually rarely that simple. Sometimes it is. Sometimes there's bad writing within our systems, and it can be that simple. So I think that looking at the current state, if you look at it long enough, you recognize it inevitably connects to the past.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in an individual like Marc Andreessen, who obviously, has a significant role in society and technology, what would you say to him if you could speak with him right now about this?
I would say that there's a couple of things. The first thing I would say is I would actually ask him a couple of questions, because whenever I assess something that I find shocking, I always look at, how could I have misinterpreted this? This is a really important part of how I do my work as a perspective alchemist, is that I recognize that any initial reaction I have is kind of a gravity that means that I should look at this, and that then my job is to become untriggered by it. I would trigger is the wrong word, but unattached to my perspective on it. And so one of the questions I would ask him is that introspection happens at the personal level, it happens at the family level, it happens at the company level, and it happens at the global level, like the global impact level, right? And so we're just calling it different things. So it's called introspection when it's applied to the self. When it's applied to a family, it may be something that looks like counseling, but it also may be just like family meetings, right? My family has business meetings all the time, right? And we're like, hey, how are we doing? How did everybody show up this week? Right? What are we, how are we showing up as a family? Somebody starts to get bent out of shape in the family. We recognize that especially with children, we recognize that the environment that we're creating is oftentimes very instrumental in somebody becoming bent out of shape, right? We see it at the company level. We see it as reporting, right? We consider company level introspection is reporting, right? It's looking at what it is that you're impacted by. At a global level, I tend to think of social media as a form of an immune system for global, right? In the sense that I'm not saying I think it may have an autoimmune disorder. I'm not going to lie.
Okay.
But that there is war is another example of an immune response to something that's happening as a result of this. You're going to have that's on a geopolitical perspective, but in a technology perspective, you have failures of companies, you have imbalances in the system that lead to failure. That is that form of introspection, right? There may not be a physical report that comes out, but there is going to be a consequence that happens as a result of an action that was taken, and the introspection and the consequence that happens, and then examining why that consequence has occurred, right? And so I would be curious as to whether or not that is something that he can, that he acknowledges that maybe he's just doing introspection, but he's doing it on a global level because he has a global impact, right?
Okay, so you're almost saying that he has made a statement that introspection is not something he does. He may actually be doing it at a very different level than self-reflection.
That's it. That'd be one question. Yep.
And I guess the question becomes would one want that to be everyone's practice, or do we feel it's important if an individual wants to grow and mature to take the time to start with oneself and then go beyond that?
Yes. So then that would be the other inquiry that I would have of him, which is if you wanted to do a global introspection, right? If you wanted to I would be curious as to what his report of the world looks like, right? I would be curious if he thinks that, I kind of compare this. I kind of compare this mentality a little bit to this idea of, if anybody's ever read Peter Pan, and I know there's a connotation here of saying, okay, well, he's being childlike or he's being Peter Pan-like, and I want to disconnect it from that. This is a pattern that I've seen a lot in our culture, and it's arisen a lot in our culture, because it makes sense that it's arisen because of the technology that we currently have available, especially with AI. Is right. This idea of, for anybody who's ever read Peter Pan, Neverland is the place of imagination. It's the place where anything that you want to create happens, right? And it's immediate and it's whatever it is. And so Peter Pan and the Lost Boys and everybody else in that culture are literally continually killing each other, right? That's the actual book of what happens, right? It's all games of war. It's all games of, they don't have any food. They like imagine having food, things along those lines. Sometimes I think we have a disconnect from reality, which stops being concerned with the community. And thus we experience this Neverland-like mentality, which is like, I'm just going to create whatever I want because it's my creation and I have the ability to do it and I have the money or I have the idea or I have the gumption or I have the action to be able to do it. And I feel like we're in a feedback cycle right now of what happens when you create without any concern for the impact of that creation. So I'd be curious as to what he thinks. I'd be curious as to whether or not he actually believes that, what is his kind of state of the world and how the world has benefited as a result of that, and how and a reflection, an introspective reflection of how it may not have.
So can you share a time in your personal life or your career where this process of introspection has shifted maybe the thoughts about what you were going to do to something different because you have a context now by which you looked at the present and said, going forward now, this is what I need to do as a choice, not just a reaction.
Absolutely. And I'll use a simple reality, which a lot of people have, which is being in a partnership, right? Being in a marriage. For me, there came a point in my introspection when it never could exist. I could never be introspective in the middle of the heat of an argument. Right. It was like there were two different states. I couldn't cross over. Right. It was like introspective requires calm and breathing. And this is a fast breathing, tightened, constricted experience. I can't do that. There came a point after enough practice when I would find myself in the middle of an argument and I would be like, who's this person arguing? And I would be like, what is she even saying? Does she actually care about any of this? And it was this weird disconnect in which the observer that got created was able to show up loud enough because I had practiced enough in which I could actually recognize that I literally had no investment in the argument in the same way that I thought I did, that there was a part of me that was very invested, but that I could easily step out of that and become the observer, right? And disconnect from this emotion of like, I have this huge problem with the dishwasher or whatever, whatever things that happen in domestic disputes, right? And so the more that I developed that observer of these states, the more I recognized that I had this very clear choice as to whether or not I wanted to, I sometimes call it walking the beast. Sometimes I love having an argument because I just have a lot of pent up stress inside of me.
Okay.
I just want to have a really good argument right now.
Okay. All right. I'll have to think about that urge. I don't know if I've ever had that urge. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure you reflect what many people experience internally.
Yes. And so knowing that I had this like walk the beast mentality of just like, I want to do this. And it's funny because my daughter has the same thing and she'll usually get angry at the end of the day. And I'm like, why are you choosing this? She's like, because I really want to have an argument. She was actually the one who helped me reflect.
That's funny.
I was like,
I'm kind
of the same way.
That is very funny. Yeah, it's like having a brawl in a bar. I just feel like punching somebody, so I'm going to go up and punch that guy.
Exactly. And so knowing that I had that choice and that I could choose to expend that energy in another way was a result of introspection. So that's there.
This episode is brought to you by Results Through Strategy. Since 2006, RTS has been the go-to partner for restaurants and food service brands navigating growth, transformation, or recovery. Their team of seasoned industry veterans helps companies rediscover their purpose, realign with their values, and implement strategies that build measurable, sustainable performance.
And what about you, Fred? I know that you have plenty of experience in your own life, but also in companies about like how you're what is your view on all of this?
Well, at the corporate level, let's say the company level rather than personal, though it does start with the person, in my opinion, my experience, I should say, is when I get into an organization that's troubled, I really try and take the initial weeks to understand why it's in the situation it's in. Mm-hmm. And it's always kind of interesting to me. There's a lot of behaviors that come out of there because if you're sort of the new guy in town as a consultant or as an acting CEO, everyone wants to blame the guy who was there before, the woman who was here before, which is very standard, very typical. I've seen that repeatedly because they can't take responsibility for why things are bad. They got to blame someone for that. And I always tell people, I really don't care who did it. I don't care. Don't tell me the names, whatever the case. If you were part of the problem, tell me what the issue was. Don't tell me it was about you. I mean, it'd be nice to have responsibility if someone says, I own this, but that rarely happens. And in understanding that, that's really going backwards to the past to understand that. But the one thing I've learned is that blame does not fix problems. Okay. And certain people and certain cultures that are toxic want to cast blame, rather than take accountability and responsibility to say, okay, whatever happened. Now we want to change it. You can only change something you're willing to take ownership for it and a sense of responsibility for it. And so introspection at that level allows me to sort of understand this and sort of see that it's like the death of 1,000 cuts. Rarely is it one thing internally that does it. There might be something externally that does it. I mean, that can happen for sure. Be it a pandemic or some economic crisis, or you mentioned war, or something that really shifts the landscape, right? That is going to be something external. Then how you respond to it is a different issue. But in terms of really understanding to look at the behaviors of people that led up to the current state is a process that I go through. Then my question becomes, how can I now take ownership? How can I now be held accountable to that? And how can I help inspire the leadership team to begin to say, we're going to change this. We're not going to keep on focusing on the past. That's where I agree with Marc Andreessen. You don't stay focused on the past constantly. You look at it, you learn from it, stay in the present moment. Say, now what choices do we need to make as an organization now to go forward? And then you begin to create the vision for the future. You begin to define your purpose. You define your values. What are the guardrails for how you're going to behave and treat people? And I'm a big believer that every organization I've ever worked in, I've done a lot of turnarounds. It only is transformed when we as leaders transform the engagement of the team member at the lowest level of the organization. When they're engaged and when they are given hope and they realize that they have a lot of power to make a critical difference, usually because we're serving a guest in the restaurant industry, or when I run a manufacturing company, we're making product that people are ultimately going to buy of some benefit to them. If you do that with intention, that absolutely transforms the organization, because you're no longer at just a transactional level. You're going to an emotional level because I care. I'm doing this with love. I'm doing this with consideration. I'm doing this with kindness. I'm being of service to somebody else. To an aspirational level is that we can transform someone's day, someone's life. And while that sounds very artsy-fartsy, on a very practical level, that's how it works. And I've seen organizations, we've been involved in situations where we've saved 10,000 people's lives in a way, because we might have had only 3,000 employees, but each one of those employees had 3 people or 2 people that depended upon them. So the ripple effect is enormous. And that's the honor that I've had to be able to be of service to people in that way. And I see it as that. I take it. A word that means a lot to me is stewardship, being entrusted with the care of another person, an individual, or their extended families. And I take that very seriously. And that becomes my focus. It's not about, gee, what can I do now that's going to make me more wonderful and great? That time's past. That was a long time ago when I suffered with hubris. And for the last, let's say, I'm going to get the math right, 40 years, I have focused now on how can I help make people great, unleash their potential, rise up beyond their scope. But look, when I was growing up, I just wanted a nice apartment and a good used car. That was pretty much the extent of my ambition when I was really young, 10, 12, 11 years old. And it changed over time because of the gift that people reached down and helped me. I broadened my horizons. I increased my expectations. And I am so blessed. I live a life now that is just unbelievably fortunate. I've worked hard for it, but I really believe it's because people saw something in me and helped me see something in myself. And that's where the introspection comes in, where you finally begin to see yourself in a way like, oh, I can do better. I don't have to stay where I'm at. I don't have to be a victim of my upbringing. I don't have to remain in this neighborhood. I don't have to be conditioned by the people's opinions of what I could or should not do. I have the ability to do that for myself. That's what introspection has given to me. And then in turn, I've been able to provide it for other people. And so when I'm, again, I meet young people that are working in a business, again, production or restaurants, doesn't really matter. And I look into their eyes, and if I don't see a light in their eyes, then my question is, what can I do to help them flip that switch? Okay, where they can ignite hope and realize that they are empowered to create a life for themselves. We're all here to do that. And if I can do that, that is tremendously rewarding.
That's brilliant, Fred. And you know what it reminds me of too is that it really does speak to the fact that, if you think of the game of life or even just the game of capitalism, right? Like if you wanted to get really clear about it, there's some beginner levels, which is, I just want to be able to survive. It almost, you could track it to Maslow's hierarchy, right? I need to be able to survive, right? Or I need my company to survive. And then there comes this point of between, so we have the, self-transcendence, right? Which is that very top layer. And then we have self-actualization, right? Which is when you're, I've done the things that are necessary to survive, and I have the freedom now to kind of do whatever I want. And I think that what you're reminding me of and what you're speaking about is that you were allowed to transcend self-actualization. It wasn't just about you creating for your sake or for the acquisition of your own resources. You didn't get stuck at the resource part of the game, right? Of I just want to keep accumulating, money or success or titles for myself. You were allowed to move, and you were pushed by your mentors and by your own nature to go into self-transcendence, right? In which you said, it's more than just about me. It's actually about wherever I want to go. And I think that introspection is an incredibly important part of that leap, right? Because in order to say it's not about me in a true way, not in a rescuer way that we've talked about, but in order to say it's not about me, you have to know what me is.
Yeah, exactly. And you go from, when I was younger in my 20s, I was guilty of hubris, when I didn't recognize that I thought I was the wave, but I was riding a wave. And that's the Greek mythology of Icarus flying too close to the sun, because you're caught up in ego and self-identity. And I had a point where I sort of had a look in the mirror and realized that being the best, being the most successful as an individual could be at the expense of the relationships in my life, my family, my friends, and so forth and so on, my colleagues. And I made a conscious decision that my best efforts were going to be in the service of others, to help them be great. And that I didn't need my success to be the most important. Their success was more important. But here's the paradox, and we talked about paradox before. The more I did that, the people elevated me. Because they entrusted themselves into my stewardship. And the more success that they got, the more success I got. That was a really powerful lesson. And so I realized, wow, this is a true win-win. Instead of win-lose, where I win at someone else's expense, if I help them win, they will push me up. And I always tell leaders that I want you to visualize that your career, your success is standing on the shoulders of all the people that report to you. And the way I see it, it's crumbling. It's a castle built on sand. Where the paradox is, if you work for their benefit to strengthen them, Now your castle's on bedrock, and it goes up and up and up because people aspirationally will say, not only do I want to be like you, I want to be led by you, because supporting you as my leader benefits me. That's the win. And that's when I say it goes down to the hourly team members. They're the ones that'll turn the business around, because I asked this other question in boardrooms. What's the average wage of your hourly employees in your businesses? And it's low. And they can't answer that. They really can't. Most of the time, they can tell me what a manager makes, because that's what they focus on. They don't focus on the hourly levels. Yet they'll say our people are our most important asset. And quite frankly, that's corporate hypocrisy. Well, if you think about it now, and let's say because of inflation and things like that, minimum wage is still ridiculously low at 7.25. But put that aside. I don't want to get into politics of it. No one's paying that really well. Actually, some companies do, but that's a different issue. Let's say your average hourly wage is $20 for a team member in certain metropolitan areas, not in the smaller towns. That's about $40,000 a year. Now take the cost of living in any metropolitan area and ask yourself, how can people make a living or support a family on $40,000 a year? Really tough. Now, when I was growing up, $40,000 a year was significant. Now it's not. And you have people who work for that, and they're probably living at home or with 6 roommates or whatever the case may be. And then we have the audacity to go to them and say, oh, we want you to smile more. We want you to care more. We want you to treat our guests or our customers or each other with, greater kindness or whatever. How is that possible when your life basically sucks? It's not possible. And that doesn't work. On the other hand, if we can help people find meaning in the simple tasks that they do, there's like an old Japanese koan that says, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. It's the same task, except now there's meaning into it. Or the other story that I really love is the story of a woman named Kristina walking on a construction site. And she sees a worker and says, excuse me, sir, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm laying bricks. I'm taking mortar, putting it on a brick and putting it on top of one another. And in fact, that's what he was doing. But she walks further down the construction site and she stops another worker and says, excuse me, sir, what are you doing? He goes, well, I'm building a wall. And as she observed his work, sure enough, that's what he was doing. And she walks further down the construction site and he says, excuse me, sir, what are you doing? And he stops, pauses, and looks at her with a smile and says, I'm building a cathedral in the honor and glory of God to serve generations to come. They're all doing the same thing. The difference is in the meaning and the connection. And who's going to show up to work on a cold, rainy day under miserable conditions and do it with perfection, with stewardship, with craftsmanship? It's going to be the person who sees a cathedral in their mind that gives meaning to the fact that they're all laying bricks. And that's exactly what a leader, I think, does. And because if you think about it, it also helps trigger some introspection for that individual to say, you aren't just laying bricks, you aren't just building a wall, you're building a cathedral, and connect him to that source. And ultimately, the cathedral one is building is inside ourselves.
Right. So you're effectively talking about, what I hear is that you're saying that if we use that same thing, you're like, you need to pull them out of survival, help them through this idea of self-actualization a little bit, right? Help them recognize that they're going to be building that thing, and then effectively wanting them to show up at work in a kind of transcendent space as much as possible. And you cannot even attempt to do that if the structure of support that you've given to each of your employees, especially your hourly employees, is built on sand. There's no survival. They can't basically survive, and you're expecting them to be at this transcendent level. It's never going to happen.
Correct. And by the way, the employees who really embrace that, guess what happens? They get more money. It starts coming to them because they've opened up the channel. They are now connected to meaning and a higher purpose, and they're connecting themselves to something that's larger than they are. And money cannot help but flow to people like that. They go back to our old episode. They go from victim to victor. And they take control of their own life. And that is a beautiful thing to see. I love to see that in organizations. And I've been blessed and fortunate to see that happen many times.
Right. And that really does speak to what we're talking about, where you talked about this paradox, right? This idea that you can absolutely see the world as transactional. You can absolutely say that if I take from here it's a zero-sum game, right? It's like, it's fundamentally a zero-sum game. Everything is a zero-sum game. And if I lose, they win. If they lose, I win. That is the bedrock of how you see the world. And if we start to recognize that zero-sum games are so incredibly limited, and that truly strategic, paradoxical living in which you give in order to receive, right? And you're like, I don't understand how this works. How am I giving in order to receive? But that's how things start to work. And we've seen it over and over and over again. And I feel like there's this growing contingent of people who are basically being like, you got to do these things that don't really make a lot of sense, but we swear they work, right? We might not understand the mechanics yet.
I agree. I mean, in a material world, transactions are limited, period. But if you enter the inner dimension that exists inside ourselves as our humanity, our mind's eye, in our hearts, in our soul, if I give you an idea, like we're sharing ideas here, okay? When we share ideas and the listeners receive them and think about them and embrace them, we haven't lost the idea. It's multiplied, okay? Mm-hmm. Because in that dimension, there is no limit. It's infinite. And that's what we're talking about. Creating meaning in someone's work is an inner world, not an outer world. But what it does by changing the inner world, the outer world changes to correspond to that. And that's really the power of it. That's what leadership's all about, is to help people reach within themselves to connect with their greater power, and where things are infinite. And then if it's infinite in our minds, then it becomes more available in our material world that we see outside of ourselves.
Yep. And I truly believe that this growing contingent is going to have to effectively be the way of it. Like, it's, I have utter faith that, the transactional way of operating is going to find some sort of decline. The more people recognize that it's not about listening to an interview like that and being like, oh, well, that guy's this, and oh, look, he's so powerful and he's in charge, and I'm going to get all negative about this and that experience, right? I would encourage everybody to say, okay, well, I don't have control over that. I may be only looking at the self and the family, or the self and the company, and I'm going to choose to change that, recognizing that every single person that I help, whether it's myself, the people in my family, the people in my company, every single person that is another person in my army for this way of living.
Right, exactly. And so to answer the question, is introspection the enemy? I don't think so. I think introspection is your best friend, because introspection allows one to get to know oneself, and there's no better person you can get to know than yourself. And then with all your strengths and weaknesses, that's what you're born to do, is to explore those, to uncover them, and then be great. And that's really what my response is to that question.
I would agree. Well said. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, Kristina.
Be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you like it, and share it with a friend. We really appreciate that. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Bye.
The Executive and the Mystic podcast, co-hosted by Fred LeFranc and Kristina Wiltsee, where wisdom meets business.